One deal that comes to mind is one that we've sold several times over the years. And this one we just most recently sold a couple months ago. It was a relatively stable, down the fairway type of transaction. And we found the buyer. We had a ton of activity on it. We put it under contract. We're getting through the due diligence process. Everything's looking good. We get to maybe 2 or 3 weeks before we're supposed to close, and we're already past all of the contract milestones that would indicate this deal is going to happen. And in the last couple of years, with all of the volatility in capital markets, it's been more and more important to have your finger on the pulse of what's happening with interest rates and with debt, and how that impacts deals, how that impacts loan proceeds, which ultimately impacts sales price and what a buyer is able to pay. And 2 weeks, I think, before the closing, we hear from the buyer and he says, everything looks good, but I have a problem. I said, what's the problem? And he tells me that his bank, who doesn't lock rate until right before closing, he tells us that they retraded him 100 basis points on the interest rate, which went from maybe 6 to 7% at the time. I don't remember the details, but something like that. And as you know, that has a pretty material impact on the NOI that a building can generate. And unless a buyer is willing to see a bigger picture perspective on that deal, a lot of times buyers will apply a cap rate valuation to that delta. And in order to hit the same cash flow returns, they need to adjust the purchase price. We were far enough along in this deal where that wasn't going to happen. The seller was not going to accept that. The buyer was at a point where he still had a contingency, so he technically had an out, and he was in a 1031 exchange, but still had plenty of time. And up until this point, both the buyer and seller personalities were starting to get a little bit emotional for a variety of reasons. And they were both at a point where either one of them could have walked away from this deal because of the now higher perception of uncertainty that the deal would close. And part of our job is, one, just keeping the personalities involved focused on the goal, getting to the finish line, getting the deal done, and moving on with their lives. But sometimes those emotions can get in the way, and buyer, seller, whoever wants to throw their hands up in the air and kill a deal and move on to somebody or something else. Part of our job is to make sure that doesn't happen. The other part of our job is figuring out how to help these guys still accomplish their goals by getting to the finish line. And because the deal changed so much for the buyer, we needed to figure out how to lessen the blow of that hit on the interest rate. So fortunately, we've got capital markets in-house. We connected with our guys on the debt side who had relationships in the space they could leverage on behalf of the buyer. Now, they weren't doing the loan, but they had relationships that they could call on. So made a few phone calls, connected with the guys that were doing the loan, and they were willing to concede 50 basis points on that rate at the 11th hour in order to make the deal work a little bit better for the buyer. Now, we didn't get the full 100 basis points back, but we did chop it in half and significantly reduced the impact of that issue. And it was just enough to get the buyer comfortable moving forward. And the seller really, really appreciated that, because instead of us just saying it's out of our hands, there's nothing that we can do, we found a solution. We kept it on track. We kept everybody focused on the goal, implemented that solution, got it done. Everyone was happy. We moved on, lived to fight another day. And now that's a solution that we can pull from in the future the next time we're encountering a similar situation for a client. That's real boots on the ground experience of not only deal making, but keeping a deal together.
It's a perfect example of how, the prep work to launch a marketing campaign, creating a market, creating competition, driving price up, selecting a buyer, that's a big part of it. But a lot of times the real work that happens is after you're under contract. That's a perfect example, because it's one thing to get it under contract at a big number. It means nothing unless it gets to the finish line at that number. And it's a perfect story for that.
And so much of it too in brokerage, I think that separates really good brokers from the rest of the pack is the people that can see a deal a few steps ahead, like you're playing a game of chess. You're trying to anticipate problems so that you can consider solutions in order to solve them before they even happen. So when you get blindsided with what seems to be a really big issue, I mean, the way that I'm communicating the black and white facts of this is not the same as when you're hearing it firsthand from a client. When they're in the middle, they spent months putting a deal together, working on it, spending their time and energy and money trying to get to this point, and now they feel as though it's not going to happen. Those phone calls are, as you know, are horrible because everybody is upset. There's emotion involved. Being able to consider that issue before it even happens puts you in a much better position to solve it. Mm-hmm. Instead of getting caught up in the stress and anxiety of the moment and assuming it's doomed from the beginning. That's I've noticed is a really big separator from the people that, you know, I look up to in this business, is being able to keep a level head and play a few steps ahead on a transaction.